Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a tabletop game designer, a lover of history, and a lifelong player of Age of Empires 2. And in this series, Theorycrafting, I take civilizations and units not yet present in the game and do as well as I can to create a believable framework for how they might actually appear if they were to be implemented in the game sometime in future. Today, we're going to be looking at a very lesser known and not well requested civilization that no one has ever before asked that I do on this channel. It's one that, unless you're from Asia, you probably won't know all that much about. In fact, even if you are from Asia, it's pretty unlikely you'll ever have heard of them before. And especially if you're online and frequenting things like YouTube comment sections and message boards and things like that, there's just a 0% chance that you have ever once heard of this civilization before. Yeah, it's really a mystery what we might be doing today. Okay, fine. You guys have asked me enough. Without a doubt, this is the single most requested civilization that I've ever had on the channel, and as such, without further ado, I present to you my build for the Tibetans. Yes, indeed, the Tibetans, which I have here as an elite and monk civilization. If you're new to the channel, the elite designation is what I give to civilizations that tend to specialize in units that cost gold. Kind of like the inverse of trash units, or what I like to call levies. As always, if you'd like any disclaimers as to my process for these builds and my philosophy as a game designer, make sure you take a look on screen right now. And as always, make sure you take a look at the comprehensive civilization document down in the description below. It has all of my sources, as well as all of the finicky little details for things like techs and unique units that I might not necessarily cover in full in this particular video. And with all that, let's move on to Tibetan history. When we are talking about the kingdoms of Tibet, we are primarily looking at a period of time between about 600 and 1200 AD. Now, of course, the Tibetan plateau has been settled for a very long time, well into BC times, and had some pretty notable settlements even way back when. But its influence began to grow once it experienced a major influx of immigration from Shang China around 1000 BC, which really started to put some of its cities on the map. It was at first a collection of petty kingdoms in the later BC and earlier AD times, until it was finally consolidated by one ruler at around 600 AD, who managed to wipe out the last of his rivals and managed to actually craft an empire for himself and his descendants. It was around this time that Buddhism was first imported from India. Now, obviously, we mostly associate Tibet with Buddhism today, but the religion at first was very much one of the elite, whereas the common people tended to practice traditional Bon animism, which influences Tibetan Buddhism even to this very day. But Buddhism wasn't the only thing that Tibet brought in from India. They also took the opportunity to introduce a bunch of societal restructuring developments influenced by Indian society, as well as their first ever official writing system, which they actually developed using Indian scholars brought in by the then Tibetan kings. So this empire building was also marked by a bunch of major efforts by Tibetan leadership to make their society more modern for their era, at the very least. And they imported plenty from China, as well as India to boot, not to mention associating with a great many of the different Indian kingdoms and provinces of their time, cutting political deals with the king of Nepal, as well as at one point earning Chinese political favor by escorting some of their emissaries through to a northern Indian province. So about halfway through the first millennium AD, Tibet was starting to become a fixture of Asian politics. They, at this point, started to ally with the nearby Gokturk peoples, joining in a military alliance with them to take part of the Tarim Basin, which critically controlled a piece of the Silk Road. Up until this point, this had been largely controlled by Tang China, and with it, they gained access to a whole host of other political opportunities among other nations in the West, as well as money. Even though Tibet only controlled this piece of the Silk Road for about 15 years, they gained a lot of wealth over exercising taxes during that time, until China decided, you know, enough is enough, we really need that back, guys. So the Tang contracted the Uyghur people to get rid of the Gokturk and Tibetan influence in the Tarim Basin, which the Uyghurs did very easily, then smashed the Gokturks before moving on to conquer their neighbors, the Sogdians. The Tibetans, while they were forced to retreat from this conflict, were not forced to make any other concessions besides the Tarim Basin, and so they managed to dodge the majority of the Uyghur rampage through the region, and in the process gained another important neighbor who they would then go on to form other political arrangements with in future. Now, it was also around this time that Tibet started to look for other allies elsewhere outside of their sphere of influence, and they found one in the burgeoning kingdom of Siam in the south. A military alliance was formed between them, and the two of them took on their major rival of Tang China, making a two-pronged attack on two of the Tang Chinese's most vulnerable fronts. This simultaneous invasion even led to Tibet capturing the Tang capital of Chang'an, which they would hold for several years before ransoming back to China at a very healthy price. And so suffice to say that Tibet was gaining serious influence at this time, even able to bring one of the greatest Chinese empires ever known to its knees. That is some serious clout. But this golden age would of course not last forever. In 797, they started to fracture back into the petty kingdoms which were united just 200 years earlier. And from there, a big divide started to form between the east and west of Tibet. The west of which tended to be more Indian and had a lot more Buddhist influence, whereas the east tended to have more Chinese influence and also tended to remain loyal to traditional Tibetan animist religious practices. And these religious divides prevented the nation from reunifying right up until about 2 centuries later, when it became Buddhified, and the Tibetan Buddhist theocracy as we know it today first started to take hold of the nation. Buddhism's influence was not welcome in Tibet right up until this mass conversion. In fact, a couple of the petty kings of Tibet even went so far as to ban Buddhist practices because they didn't like the amount of power that Buddhist religious leaders were starting to gain. Not to mention, Bon animism strongly resisted Buddhist influences for as long as it possibly could, and as mentioned, Bon traditions are still alive in Tibet today, though admittedly mostly taking on a Buddhist coat of paint. But even though Tibet was reunified at this point, it did not regain its status as a power. Why? Well, not only did the Buddhist theocracy not have nearly the same expansionist tendencies as its earlier kingdoms did, but in about 1200 AD, we get our good old friends the Mongols coming back in to ruin the party. They came in, swept through, conquered Tibet, and with them brought famine. And boy, was it an awful famine. It was a series of famines that lasted almost 200 years and absolutely decimated the wealth and health of the country. And only in 1354 AD, when the Ming Chinese kicked out the Mongols, did Tibet start to kind of regain its footing. It was effectively a vassal to the Ming, but it retained a little bit of nominal independence right up until the end of the AoE2 relevant timeframe, though it never again made any sort of imperial claim while under Ming control. And so, diminished in power, but certainly not in spirit, where do we find Tibet today? Tibet today has obviously faced a battery of human rights atrocities and oppressions by their Chinese overlords, and though their Buddhist theocracy remains largely intact, it is certainly not a blameless victim in all of the trials and tribulations that Tibet has been subject to over the years either. But folk traditions are still hanging on strong in Tibet. While much of it is touristified, it does seem like the country is starting to regain a little bit of its footing, and hopefully within our lifetimes we will see Tibet emerge, maybe not as a power, but as a dignified member of the world stage like it was so many years ago. And with that, let's move on to the flavor. What would my Tibetan build look and feel like in-game? Well, let's start with the architecture. It would be a North Asian architecture set that would be shared by a couple other civilizations. And what would that look like? Well, I have another presentation ready for you guys. A presentation within a presentation. We're going to move through this a little bit fast. North Asian architecture, which would be shared by the Mongols, as well as my Jurchens build, check that out here if you'd like, and these Tibetans build, as well as perhaps the Cumans and Huns, though I'm not necessarily as sold on that. Big thanks to my good friend and commenter Tomasz Stanek for the formatting. He has made architecture presentations for me like this before, and they are absolutely gorgeous. I also just realized that my title is cut off by my stupid face. That's what I get. In fact, let me turn off my camera for just a moment so you guys can see this thing in its full glory. All right, let's take a look through. Starting in the Dark Age, the North Asian architecture set would have a yurt aesthetic in the Dark Age, namely mostly rawhides on wooden frames with plenty of colorful decorations and a good bit of painting in there as well. Now, I should note that yurts are still used to this day. The fact that the Dark Age is a yurt aesthetic here is not to say that this was a primitive form of housing. Yurts are obviously a more nomad-centric form of housing, and as such, this shift should demonstrate how Tibetan cities started to become more concentrated and large, rather than just being roving bands of nomads. So what would this look like? Well, we have a bunch of yurt models currently in game right now, and I think we could have something like this for the house. The town center, at least a piece of it, could be the bigger yurt, and I even found a really cool depiction of an old style of mill that we might be able to use as well. Now, Dark Age obviously does not have unique architecture as of now, but I think it should, so we're going to go with this for the moment. But if you want something that's a little more traditional, let's look at Feudal Age. It's going to be mostly brick and clay over wooden beams, with a good amount of mosaic and cloth decorations, and even a little bit of doming and arching forming right now. You could think of it almost like a combination of the current Central Asian architecture, plus a little bit of the Middle Eastern architecture set. What would it look like? Something a little bit like this. You can see all that really cool, like, layered brickwork with clay daub over it. This one on the left looks like it could be a barracks to me, and then we have another kind of like maybe TC candidate, even has that little arch that the town centers tend to have, and then a possible house example over on the side. Now, once you hit the Castle Age, you're going to start to see white plastered brickwork. It still has that kind of blocky, steppish construction that we see mirrored in other architecture sets, but you'll start to notice some red trim and embellishments being depicted around this time, which you see all across North Asia. For some examples, we have another house over on side, as well as a beautiful monastery, trying to match more traditional animist styles, though as you will see shortly, the Tibetans would have a different monastery skin because they weren't always animist, especially during their golden age. And then what I think could be a pretty cool university. Note those beautiful cloth decorations out in front, and a little bit of gold as well as the red trim on its roofline. And lastly, for Castle Age, I wanted to show you an example of what I think the generic castle skin could look like. It has this gorgeous green roof, which, as we'll get to shortly, is characteristic of later stage North Asian architecture, as well as what I think could be a cool little barracks. Once again, note the red trim and gold decorations. Lastly, Imperial Age. Beautiful green roofs. They have kind of a pagoda aesthetic at this point, and they retain the wonderful red and gold embellishments all across the walls. They also have a lot more intricate decorations, which I think could be a really good way to help add pop and flair, much like the beautiful blue domes do on Central Asian architecture sets right now. We have a couple of examples of buildings that I could see here, like a barracks and a university and maybe some town centers, and then a little house down on the side. And I hope you can see the opulence on display here. These are really sumptuous and luxurious styles of architecture and reflect how, during the golden ages of many North Asian civilizations, they had a lot of money to play with and imperial ambitions to capitalize upon. Now, a couple of disclaimers for you. I am no architecture expert whatsoever, and I'm really oversimplifying the reality. All of these styles coexisted at various points. I'm more trying to show a progression of wealth and grandeur within the context of a single Age of Empires game. It's mostly like a mishmash of Mongolian and Tibetan architecture. It doesn't really have a ton of Jurchen in there, but that's often how architecture styles are constructed. And while I'm obviously pitching this as a regional architecture set, my dream in Age of Empires is that every civilization could have completely unique architecture sets. Is this a pipe dream? Probably, but if you look at some of the mods that even HD had at one point, there were comprehensive civilization-specific architecture sets made by the community. I do think this is possible. If you want to see my sources, take a look on screen right now, or follow the link down in the description. I'm going to have this entire architecture presentation included in full for you to consult at your own pace. And with all that, let's move back. There we go. To the main Tibetan presentation. That was North Asian Architecture by Robbie Howell. I hope you enjoyed. Now, as mentioned, the Tibetans would have a unique skin for the monastery as well as the castle. While the typical North Asian skin for a monastery would be along a more animist bent, I wanted to give them a more Buddhist style one because even though Buddhism was not the major religion for much of Tibetan imperial history, it is what we largely associate them with today and was, as mentioned, a religion of the elite, so having it only be available in and Castle Age makes some amount of marginal sense. And, of course, they'd have a unique skin for the castle as well, because that is common practice. Their language would be Classical Tibetan, Tashi Delek, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for my pronunciation on that. And their wonder would be the Sakya Monastery, famous for its beautiful golden roofs and red walls, soaring cliffs behind it dotted with little shrines. It's a really beautiful building, and I'm sure there could be a spectacular mock-up of it done in-game. Now, for some AI player names, make sure you take a look on the screen right now. Apologies for forgetting that last video, but it's going to be standard from now on. If you want more specific details on any of these historical figures, make sure you take a look at the full civilization document down in the description, where all of these details will be in full. Let's move on to campaigns. There are two main campaigns I propose as options for the Tibetans, the first being Gsung-bum, not the man who started it all, but the first of Tibet's great Dharma kings, a trio of rulers so impactful on the country's history that they have been elevated to saint-like status in the eyes of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, Gsung-bum was the second king of a unified Tibet. He picked up where his father left off by smashing his father's old rivals at the tender age of 13, before going on an extensive quest of politicking and conquest all across the Tibetan plateau and beyond. He made some of the first forays into China. His diplomatic interactions with India were absolutely crucial, and he was also the main influence behind the adoption of Indian societal and technological developments. At one point, he became powerful enough that he demanded a princess of the Tang dynasty, who refused, sent an army, and he smashed them into the dust, at which point they said, okay, take your princess and go away, and he did. Their union is mythologized and used in propaganda even to this very day. He is a classic Golden Age figurehead like we see in many of these campaign proposals across various civilizations, and I think the civilization variety and scenario variety that could be seen in a Gsung-bum campaign could be absolutely exceptional, easily enough to make him the primary campaign I would suggest for the Tibetans. But there is one other I would recommend as well. That being the third, I believe, of the great Dharma kings, Trison Detsen. While Songtsen was the first great Buddhist king, I would argue that Trison Detsen was its greatest ever. He was the first to make Buddhism the state religion and made some serious inroads into Chinese territory. He was even the one who made that military alliance with Siam to attack China from two directions and took their frickin' capital. At which point, he also retook part of the Silk Road and smashed the Sogdians in the process. An incredibly dynamic ruler whose measured but daring political decisions elevated Tibet to its highest point across all of history. Also, very good civilization variety, which is always a big plus for me. I think he would be even more dynamic and interesting than Gsung-bum, but is a slightly less obvious pick, as he came about 150 years after the founding of Tibet as an empire. Still, I would be remiss not to mention him. Now, would the Tibetans appear in any existing campaigns? Perhaps Genghis Khan won when you're talking to all those different tribes. Maybe you could use the Tibetans there, though I think the historical accuracy would be extremely dubious. I would personally not include the Tibetans in that scenario. And unfortunately, that's really all the options we have. The Tibetans really wouldn't slot in nicely to any existing Age of Empires scenario, but they certainly could if other campaigns were made in the East Asia region, especially pre-1000 AD. Now, before we wrap up the flavor section, I want to mention some other campaign ideas I had that didn't have quite as much clout as the first main two, but still are very interesting historical figures that would be great to see represented in-game. The first being Songtsen Namri. He was Gsung-bum's father and was the first unifier of Tibet. That sounds like a very important position within history. Why didn't I choose to include him? Well, most of his campaigning was done against fellow Tibetan tribes. He had many rivals within Tibet, and it was his job to consolidate the various warring and infighting Tibetan clans into a single empire, aided and assisted by his many political marriages, including to, I believe, a Nepali princess who was one of the first major advocates for Buddhism in Tibet. An interesting character, no doubt, but since civilization variety is very important to me, I thought he was less important than either his son or great-great-great-whatever-great-grandson. The other of my two alternate campaign proposals is the only non-king on this list, this being a man named Gar Tongtsen. He was the great general and advisor to Gsung-bum, who was actually the brains behind many of Songtsen's most famous political and military maneuvers. Gar Tongtsen was even Gsung-bum's main emissary to Tang China, and handled a lot of the military actions against China on the border during the beginning of their major conflict. His children would go on to be so influential within Tibet that it would require a later Tibet ruler to curb the influence of the Gar clan and even kill off a number of Gar Tongtsen's own heirs, just because of how much political and military influence his clan accrued during his position behind the throne. A really interesting guy who could lead to some, I think, incredibly unique scenario options, but he's less famous than either of the other two and didn't interact with quite as many civilizations, so I still think that he would be better as an auxiliary than as a main campaign feature. And with that, let us move on to the major themes that I identified while reading through Tibetan history. There were a lot of very unusual ones. It's rare that a civilization really surprises me, but medieval Tibet is really nothing like what we think of it today as being. Firstly, Tibet was known for its fierce warrior tradition. Theirs was a blend of steppe, Chinese, and Indian warfare all bundled into one, incorporating all of their best elements into an absolutely devastating and fast military force. Not only did they have exceptional cavalry and archery, but they even had an extremely strong infantry corps, unlike many other steppe peoples that were their neighbors. They even incorporated military philosophy into their religious traditions, referring to the bow, lance, and sword as the three circles, and placing them on a pedestal even within Tibetan Buddhism as being sanctified weapons that held religious power beyond their obvious pragmatic uses in battle. Tibet was largely a pastoralist economy even during its golden age, and they integrated elements of their pastoralist lifestyle into their warfare in a very effective manner. Blend this with the fact that Tibet had one of the earliest conscription systems of East Asia, and you have an incredibly effective military force that was able to be levied at a very rapid rate and was remarkably elite considering the relatively humble origins of many of its soldiers. They developed an incredibly fearsome reputation among all their neighbors, with even mighty Tang China refusing to tango with the Tibetans unless absolutely backed into a corner. Now, the second major theme I noticed was the dynamic between Buddhism and Bon animism. Now, as I mentioned, Buddhism was, for the first several hundred years of its presence within Tibet, solely a religion of the nobility. The common folk rejected Buddhism and were even very hostile to it, with some Buddhist neighbors of Tibet remarking that whenever Tibetan raiders came a-knocking, they would often explicitly target and torch Buddhist monasteries, pilfering the riches inside, with absolutely no regard to the nominal religious fraternity between their two countries. Now, the Buddhist theocracy did come to power within the AoE2 timeframe, but it was well after the golden age of Tibet, which my build is trying largely to represent. And even once Tibetan Buddhism gained dominance, it retained elements of Bon animism, carrying forward many of its more militant attitudes, as well as many of its ritual and cultural elements. So don't just think of Tibet as a Buddhist country, especially during Age of Empires 2. There were two major religions that equally defined its medieval history. Now, the third major theme I want to talk about is societal and tech adoption. The Tibetans went out of their way to send emissaries to neighboring powers, learn what they could from those venerable and elite nations, and bring them back home to Tibet to implement as best they could. I've obviously mentioned this in the context of Buddhism and writing systems and social reforms, but it was also true for military technology, with weapon and armor-making traditions adopted and perfected in Tibet. They even had their own manner of forging Damascus steel, which they would have imported all the way from South India up through Persia. And with all that, we come to the end of the history section for this Tibetans build. If that's all you were here for, thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe before you go. Maybe ring the little bell icon if that's something that YouTube still wants you to do. But for all those of you who, like me, love Age of Empires and want to see how I've converted Tibetan history to game mechanics, let us move on to an overview of the civilization. The Tibetans, an elite and monk civilization. Their first bonus is as follows. Building a barracks, archery range, or stable yields between 10 and 50 food and gold depending on your age. This functionally discounts these buildings by 100 resources in Imperial Age, and is meant to represent not only the largely militant attitude of Tibet and how militarization was built into much of its more pastoral economy, but also the reverence given to weapons in both Bon and Buddhist traditions, as well as the fact that many Tibetan garrisons held vast stores of food that they would dole out during famine times. This is the Tibetans' only economy bonus, and while it will be a great way of supplementing your force's late game and helping out with rush timings early on, I imagine it being largely incremental, unless you're in a late game scenario where you can build like 30 or 40 military buildings. Their second bonus is that all of their armor techs per age are bundled into one. Yes, indeed, they only have to research one technology to give their infantry, archers, and cavalry full armor bonuses. Very, very strong. Tibetan armor was known for its beautiful craftsmanship and early adoption across very large swaths of their armies, while many other neighboring powers were still fielding largely unarmored levies as the vast majority of their forces. And this will not only lend itself extremely well to timings, as the previous bonus does as well, but will also save the Tibetans a few resources, especially if they're trying to do some combined arms play in feudal or castle age. Third bonus. Supplies and gambesons benefit cavalry archers and steppe lancers. These technologies also each give +1 line of sight and +5% speed. Don't worry, the Tibetans miss both squires and husbandry, so they're not going to double dip on those. Swordsmen, mounted archers, and mounted lancers were the absolute core triad of any Tibetan army. Like I said before, those three weapons formed the three circles of Tibetan sacred weaponry, and so this bonus is not only trying to promote those three weapons as being special and different, but is also trying to reference the efficient conscription system by which Tibetan armies were levied, and the famous beautiful plumes that many Tibetan helms had, allowing generals to easily see them from afar and maneuver them in the heat of battle, hence the +1 loss, though I could see that being a little bit of a stretch. Moving on to their team bonus, their monks have -33% train time, and since monks take a while to train, this would be saving something like 15 to 20 seconds. If you saw last week's video, part 1 of my major religious overhaul, you know I have a lot of problems with how monks are used in-game right now, but as such, this team bonus should be pretty helpful in helping the Tibetans and their allies get a foothold on certain maps like Arena where monks are relevant, and to produce counter monks quickly in the face of an enemy night rush. So I imagine it will still be quite useful. It would be very weak if it were a civilization bonus, but as a team bonus, I think it will have some good utility and represent the dominance and prominence of both Buddhism and Bon within Tibet's history. I forgot to mention, I actually have little icons made for each of the unified Tibetan armor upgrades. Bze Krab would be a kind of scaled leather armor, Byangbu would be a more traditional splint mail, and then Mulongbji would be a mirror armor, the likes of which you see commonly used across Central Asia, pretty much from Persia to China, and is effectively a scale or lamellar suit of armor with 4 large circular plates protecting each of the cardinal directions of the body. These armors were all worn by pretty much all stripes of the Tibetan military across its golden age. Let's move on to their unique unit, the Takrab Pai'dpungpa. I am simplifying the spelling, by the way. The true Tibetan spelling is vastly more complicated. I have a lot of trouble pronouncing anything in this language, so apologies for the consolidation. This would be an interesting hybrid cavalryman costing 40 food, 30 wood, and 50 gold, a 3 resource cost. It would be a heavy cavalry, overall distinctly weaker than the knight. It would have higher armor, but distinctly lower health, attack, and rate of fire. It, however, can swap between 3 weapons in the following order, with a 6-second cooldown every time you want to switch between them. First of all, in sword and shield mode, it would gain some anti-armor and building damage, it would gain a better rate of fire, and it would get a lot more pierce armor. That's a pretty good bonus. Secondly, in its lance form, it would gain a charge attack, a little bit worse than a Custilier. Third of all, in its bow form, it would gain a ranged attack similar to the Ratha, much like my unique unit for the Pai'dpungpa, the Kwangariecha. Take a look up here if you want to see that build for yourself as well. This triple weapon dynamic is not only in reference, again, to the 3 circles of Tibetan military sanctity, but I think will make for a really interesting hybridized style of play, where differently designating your Takrab Pai'dpungpa is very important at different stages of a battle. You want to start with the lance, swap to the sword, and maybe retreat and fire with the bow, which I think is really cool. And the fact that the swap has a cooldown should make it such that you can't spam these and just get exactly what you need at exactly the time that you need it, which I think would make the unit a little bit too powerful. So in summary, a strong unit that, if you're good with it, might even be able to serve as the very core of your army. On to the unique text before we finish up with this overview. First of all, Gongkang. Each garrisoned relic grants +1 attack and, that is a mistake, that should be -20% train time to either sword, bow, or spear elite units. Editing Rob, if you could fix that, that would be great. Thank you. Now, this is meant to apply on the sword side to both the militia and knight lines. For the bow, it applies to both the archer and cavalry archer lines, and to the spear, it applies to the steppe lancer and the footman lines. It should still work in game right now regardless, even if my footman unit wasn't added. Go check out that build here if you would like. But if it was, it would add perfect symmetry to the whole 3 weapons, 2 units each dynamic. So how would you know what relic was boosting what type of weapon? Well, when you garrisoned that relic, it would gain a little mini icon over the garrisoned relic depicting a spear, sword, or bow, and you could ungarrison the relic and regarrison it to get a different type, meaning that with just a little bit of extra micro, you should be able to grab exactly the type of weapon that you were hoping for. I should note, however, you would not be able to double up on a specific weapon type unless you had more than 3 relics garrisoned. That means if you already have a bow and a sword relic, the third will always be a lance. This just makes sure you can't get something ridiculous like plus 5 attack and minus 100% training time on any given unit type you wanted, which would be a little silly even for my builds. Now I should note, the unique unit, the Pai'dpungpa, would benefit from the reduced training time regardless of what types of relics you had garrisoned, though its benefits would cap out at minus 40%, so 2 relic benefits just like normal. The attack bonuses it gained, however, would be appropriate to its form. So if you had a sword relic garrisoned and it was in sword form, it would get the +1 attack, it would not in bow form. Unlike many Castle Age unique technologies, I could see Gongkang becoming an incredibly important and defining part of the Tibetan playstyle. It is obviously, once again, representing the 3 circles, which I think were really cool and were a major focus of my build, but Gongkang were specifically these shrines where consecrated weapons were placed and prayed to. Like, this spear killed 18 enemies of Buddhism. Come receive its blessings when you're going to fight the enemy yourself. So sick, and such a perfect fit for a bonus like this. I could see almost all Tibetan players picking Gongkang up in Castle Age, unless they somehow manage to lose out on every single relic. It's obviously very comparable to the Lithuanian bonus, a little bit stronger for sure, but gated behind both a castle and getting the technology, though you do also have the option to forego Gongkang if your opponent has captured the relics well before you can. In many ways, I would call this technology the cornerstone of the civilization and will be one of the biggest things that defines how your opponent is playing around you in-game. Second unique technology, Gsung-bum. Jeez, that's hard to pronounce. This allows your monks to heal enemy units, to drain their hit points and armor. Gsung-bum were a sort of sorcerer that was common among Bon animists that were even adopted into Tibetan Buddhism to some degree, who were called in to help out with famines and stuff like that, but would also readily curse those who crossed them, and were very feared both among Tibetans and their neighbors. This effect will obviously make Tibetan monks much more useful outside of high micro scenarios, because this anti-healing effect, we'll call it cursing, I guess, would drain HP at double the rate that a monk can normally heal. It would drain armor at a rate of -1 per second, and just like with an obuk, the armor could not be regained unless the affected unit was healed by a friendly monk. Some very powerful utility, especially when you consider that Tibetan monks can be massed up much faster than normal. They might even be somewhat usable in numbers greater than 2 or 3, because they will prioritize cursing enemies over healing allies if there are 2 valid targets within their range, meaning that they won't be nearly as reliant on micro, though of course they still will be very vulnerable, and though this cursing effect will drain HP pretty fast, it certainly won't be able to keep pace with the vast majority of Imperial Age units coming to kill them. As always, please remember to check out the Civilization doc down in the description if you want details on any of these bonuses, technologies, or the unique unit. Let's move on to an overview of the Tibetans' tech tree, starting with their infantry. It is a B. They have the champion, but they don't have halberdier or squires. Their champion doesn't care about missing squires, because not only do they get extra benefits from supplies and gambesons, but they also can be pretty substantially buffed by Gongkang, as well as allowing you to recoup a little bit of food and gold whenever you build a barracks. While infantry are definitely less prioritized among Tibetans than archers or cavalry, and missing halberdier does really hurt, I figured giving them anything less than a B would undersell the raw power that their champions are able to quite easily attain. Also, of course, infantry benefit from the consolidated armor bonus, which is no doubt very useful and substantially reduces the cost of entry for teching into the unit. This is something you'll notice a lot with the Tibetans. Their infantry, archers, and cavalry all share a lot of bonuses, and as such, they have very similar grades in my eyes. Speaking of which, Tibetan archers get a B+. Their heavy cavalry archers are fully upgraded, and while they do miss Arbalester, which kind of sucks, they all benefit from all of those above civilization bonuses. The cavalry archer benefits from supplies and gambesons, they get resources refunded for building an archery range, they share the combined armor technologies, and they get benefits from Gongkang. It's very solid. It's not necessarily specialized, and you have to jump through a couple of hoops, but still totally worthy of a B+. Cavalry. Also a B+. Their Steppe Lancers benefit exactly as outlined above, and the Pai'dpungpa is a cornerstone of their strategy. They do miss the Paladin and they miss Husbandry, so their Hussars and Cavaliers will be distinctly worse than their elite Steppe Lancers, but it's still a very respectable stable and easily makes up the third leg of their combined arms triad, which is very much the focus of the playstyle that I'm trying to craft here for the Tibetans. For Siege, it's a D+. It is doo-doo. They don't have Siege Engineers, Onager, Siege Ram, or Bombard Cannon. Not to mention, none of their combined arms civilization bonuses benefits their Siege. You still have Trebuchets, they'll be able to do Trebuchet things, but you probably will never make anything out of the Siege Workshop, besides maybe Mangonels and Castle Age, or a couple Capped Rams if you're really having trouble bringing down something late game. Defenses, it's a C-, kinda doo-doo as well. They have hoardings and architecture, so their castles are quite good, but they lack fortified wall, bombard tower, treadmill crane, and a couple of other smaller university technologies. You can play a little bit of defense with the Tibetans, but for the most part you want to rely on your high mobility armies to go zigzagging over the map, get map control to pick up relics, and stuff like that. You don't want to be sitting in your base. Particularly because the Tibetans have a very poor economy. They don't have crop rotation, gold shaft mining guilds, and most importantly, bow saw. They are stuck with double bit axe, so they are going to be starving for wood late game. This should help balance out the refunded resources off of building military buildings late game. You won't be able to spam down nearly as many because your wood economy will be so starving. And though they will save a little bit of resources from their various consolidated technology bonuses and from getting a little bit of stuff back from dropping military buildings, for the most part as the Tibetans, you're going to need to getting value off your strong military rather than any sort of accrued advantage from booming. Next of all, levies. It's not brilliant. It's a D+. Their skirmishers are fully upgraded, and they do benefit from combined armor bonuses, but not having halberdiers, squires, or husbandry does hurt. I guess you could maybe argue that a C- is a slightly better grade, but I feel like as the Tibetans, if you are making levies rather than your 3 circle units, you are probably not winning the game. Dock. It's a D. It sucks. What a surprise. It's a mountain society that only had access to water via rivers, and as such, they're missing everything. No galleon, no fast fire ship, no cannon galleon, no careening, no shipwright. Don't play them on a water map. And lastly, for monks, it's an A. They have a very good monk tree. Gongkan obviously means that you want to be sending monks out to get relics super early, so they're highly incentivized towards that unit. Gsung-bum will give monks a lot more to do late game, and you'll even have a slightly easier time teching into monks because of your resource refund bonus, giving you a little bit of extra gold for some early timings in Castle Age. You also have a perfect tech tree and reduced training time from your team bonus. If that's not an A monk tree, I don't know what is. That being said, let's move on to the playstyle that I envision the Tibetans having. How would they look in game if they were implemented as I have them here? Well, first of all, in early game as the Tibetans, you have some really good rush options. Not only are all of your rushes available, but they are better than average. Having all the armor techs bundled together is especially useful for combined arms feudal play, so if you're able to, for example, get some archers or scouts out to help out your early man-at-arms rush, then saving 100 or 150 resources on another armor tech is a really big boon and should make late feudal age one of the Tibetans' strongest points during a typical game. That being said, your eco early on is almost completely generic. You do get a couple of resources here and there from making military buildings, but you really don't want to rely on it. So you'll typically want to be playing aggressive early as the Tibetans to make up for this lack of economic power. In mid-game, however, your core army comp comes online. Once you start picking up relics from Gonggang, you'll be able to start churning out steppe lancers and cavalry archers and knights and swordsmen that are much stronger than what your opponent has to offer, especially if you can pick up more consolidated techs like I mentioned earlier. Obviously, the Pai'dpungpa is a great option to supplement whichever of the 3 weapons you decide to end up focusing on. Your double duty techs are really going to be important here. Being able to pick up supplies and gambesons and have them give such a big power spike to your core 3 units can lead to some big timings. I could see Cavalry Archer and Steppe Lancer play for the Tibetans rivaling even the Huns in terms of its effectiveness. Just remember that you're going to need to get your monks out early, so you're going to want to have a few more villagers on gold than usual, though maybe building some military buildings will help you recoup that. But the fact that you can get your monks out faster than other civilizations, and you have a very good reason to, namely picking up relics, means that you almost always want to have a monastery be one of the first buildings you make as the Tibetans once you hit Castle Age. So in summary, if you're playing the Tibetans effectively, I would argue they have one of the single best mid-game army compositions in the game, but once you hit late game, you're going to start to encounter a few more problems. Your core army comp, however, is not one of those. You still have some very strong elite units at your disposal, and your monks are quite good. If you end up having a good number of them, then picking up Gsung-bum will give them a lot more to do on the battlefield and make them even more of a threat than they would normally be off of conversion alone. That being said, once post-imperial starts to hit, your levies are really not awesome, and you're going to want to try to supplement them with gold units wherever you can, not to mention your eco starts hitting a wall. Not having Bosa sucks, and you're missing a bunch of other important late game eco techs as well. That being said, if you do manage to put together the wood economy for it, then spamming military buildings all over the place can kind of help out a little bit, especially late game, where gold is at a premium, and building a barracks to grab 50 gold could actually be a pretty decent deal. So overall, I imagine the Tibetan win graph looking something like this. Doing pretty well early on, amazing mid-game, and then falling off a cliff post-imperial, which matches quite accurately to their history, if I do say so myself. Before we finish off the build, let's touch upon some loose threads. Some lingering questions and ideas that I had that didn't quite make the build, but I would be remiss not to mention now. Starting with some uncertainties. The elite triad is, as I mentioned, missing the footman. It would be awesome to have 2 elite units for each of the 3 types of weapons, and I think that the build could really benefit from having the footman included. If for nothing else besides the historicity argument, Tibetan armies did very frequently feature spear and shield vanguard units, but I do think that the build works pretty well without that unit all the same, even if it means that the lance is probably the weapon you will prioritize the least with Gsung-bum. Secondly, this build might not feel Tibetan to many viewers. Obviously, we have a very different association of what Tibet is in the modern day than what it was in history. Like, the idea that this oppressed theocracy was once a fierce warrior state might be kind of incongruent to many people, and my build does not focus at all heavily on Tibet's Buddhist era. So I could see another build that focused more on later Tibet, like after about 1000 AD, as being a very valid way of approaching this build. I just wanted to focus on the country's glory days, during which time Buddhism was in fact less prominent and war was very much on the mind. So let me know what you think of that. Lastly, the military building bonus. I think the scaling into late game might be a little too high, like I might want to tone the numbers back down later on, and I could also see removing the barracks from the equation, so you only get refunded resources off of archery ranges and stables. Those two are much more intuitively connected to Tibet's pastoralist economy than the barracks is, and so I could see that be a way of nerfing the bonus if people thought it was too strong. Let's round off with some tabled ideas. These are things that didn't quite make the build, but I was very close to including. First of all, the caravanserai. In my Swahili's build, go take a look at that now, I mentioned a rework for the caravanserai, making it a regional building available to a great many civilizations with some new effects added onto it. And Tibet did control pieces of the Silk Road at various points during its history, so because of that, should they get the caravanserai? I've tried to emphasize a weak economy as being one of the main things that holds the Tibetans back, and this is an economy-oriented building, but I could see the argument for including it, so let me know what you guys think down in the comments about this one in particular. Another one, as you saw in my mistake in the overview section, bonus HP for 3 circles units rather than reduced creation time. The issue with this was the unique unit. If it got bonus HP in one form but not the others, that could lead to some really annoying and confusing in-game math. So once I realized that as an issue, I pivoted to faster creation time, which I think is more balanced and quite possibly more useful as well. Another one, an early game bonus being that herdable locations are all revealed on the map, much like a Burmese player does with relics. Tibet was obviously a very pastoralist society, and stealing enemy livestock was a big part of their early days, especially before their consolidation into an empire. It's a cool bonus, definitely one I want to use on a build someday, but it didn't fit as much with the design that I had in mind for the Tibetans, and obviously very much incentivizes laming. Next, theocracy being free and available from Castle Age. This would be a very clean way to implement Buddhism's influence without going too overboard. If the civilization felt underpowered, this would probably be the single bonus I would be most interested in adding to them. Next, heavy cavalry archer and Parthian tactics are much cheaper and available in Castle Age. Mounted archers, according to one academic source I read, were likely the single most important piece of any Tibetan army, and these mounted archers were often heavily armored and well-trained, and as such, I can't think of a better way to represent this army comp than with a bonus like this. The only reason I didn't do it is since the 3 circles were such a big part of my theming, I didn't want to elevate any one 3 circles weapon above the other 2, but this would be a great way to approach the build if you didn't want to go in that direction. Another one, units get plus 50% speed when adopting a new formation. Tibet was known for its dynamic and mobile strategies in war, running circles around enemies and effortlessly commanded from afar by their generals thanks to plumed helmets and colorful banners. I thought this would be an incredibly cool and unique bonus to represent those elements of Tibet's history, but it just slightly got beaten out by, once again, the 3 circles theming that I ended up focusing the build around. Just know that this is one of my favorite bonuses I ever came up with, and you will certainly be seeing it on a future build. And lastly, changing the food and gold bonus off of barracks and archery range to making it a food bonus off of building a castle. As mentioned, military buildings in Tibet often held grain stores for famine relief, and this was particularly true for castles. If people felt like the food and gold bonus was simply unsalvageable, this is closer to what I would convert it to, maybe with adding some gold in there as well to just make it feel a little bit more different and dynamic from other civilizations. Lastly, some unique units and unique technologies. Pai'dpungpa. Wow, Tibetan is hard to pronounce. This would be a armored warlord famous during Tibet's petty kings era. It would be a unique unit randomly spawning as either a very tanky infantry unit, a quick mounted cavalry archer, or a high damage lance cavalryman. You can see a very similar theme to the Pai'dpungpa that I ended up going with, which not only represents Tibet during a better part of its history, but also removes randomness, which of course you know I hate, though I think this one would actually be quite fun and would end up being a fan favorite. Next, the Gsung-bum. The lasso was one of the most well-renowned weapons in all of Tibetan military history. The lasso of all things. How freaking cool is that? I would love to have a lasso unit in the game. This would be a stable unique unit, a levy unit costing no gold that would have piddly damage and pretty low HP, but very high speed and the ability to entangle enemy units to prevent them briefly from moving, especially enemy cavalry. I love this idea. If people thought that the build was a little on the underpowered side, I would jump at a chance to introduce this to their stable, because how sick would that be? Next, some unique technologies. Gsung-bum. This is the name for effectively the collective works of a Tibetan lama, or later Buddhist religious leader, and it would make each relic boost conversion speed. So obviously a different take on the Gongkang bonus. I like Gongkang better because it reflects the 3 circles, of course, and it also represents Tibet more during its golden days, but this would be a very valid replacement if you were trying to focus on the more Buddhified era. Another Buddhist-related unique technology, Earth Terma. This would make monks regain faith very fast near a relic. Terma were, for want of a better word, like a religious secret or mystery or hidden teaching, and they were typically split into earth and sky terma, earth terma being like physical objects that had some sort of religious mysticism to them. So this would represent Tibetan Buddhist monks contemplating some sort of grander religious mystery while around a holy relic. It's a cool idea. I quite like it, just not as good as the ones I have now. Another one, Monlam Chempo. This was a grand prayer festival regularly held during the Buddhified era. This would give monks plus 50% range, but make their conversions much slower when converting beyond their standard maximum. Really, really cool. Very, very strong. Very, very Buddhist. That's not the direction I was taking the build in. And lastly, Las Rgyubras. This was the Tibetan conception of karma and was readily adopted into Tibetan Buddhist policy and governmental philosophy. This would be an incredibly weird technology that made it so that whichever player had the highest score would reduce their work rate for all of their villagers and buildings. Not by a lot, but enough to hurt if it was a very high score. Whereas whoever had the lowest score would get bonus work rate for all their villagers and buildings. Weird technology, really messy, would completely warp the build. You know I like warping builds, but I liked the theming that I had better than this one. It's an interesting idea, though. Definitely one of the more extreme ideas I've ever come up with. Next, unique technology, Fong Spiad. This was a name for archery kit more broadly. There were many, many pieces to a Tibetan cavalry archer's kit, and this unique technology would make archers, and cavalry archers I should note, train faster and take less bonus damage. Again, if we were going the heavy cavalry archer focus route, this would be an awesome unique technology to add. I think it could be a cool way to make tanky cavalry archers a focus for the Tibetans, which would be something pretty unlike most other civilizations. Next, Tabs. This is like connoisseurship of swords and swords making in particular, and this would give sword units bonus attack, and a higher gold cost by a little bit, but a much lower non-gold cost, benefiting both the knight line and the militia line. Again, cool bonus. You've heard me say it before, but I'll say it again. If I were not trying to focus on a combined arms style of play, this is a very interesting way of going about it to make the sword and knight line at the same time a lot better. And lastly, Gsung-bum. To anyone who can speak Tibetan watching, I apologize for my awful pronunciation this episode. Gsung-bum directly translates to 3 circles, and this would be a unique technology that, if I decided to really commit to the combined arms style of play, would be the capstone to it. This would give a Fire Emblem style weapon triangle counter system across your sword, bow, and lance units. Sword units would deal bonus damage to enemy bow units, your bow units would deal bonus damage to enemy lance units, and your lance units would deal bonus damage to enemy sword units. And vice versa. Your swords would take less damage from enemy bows, etc., etc., etc. Very, very cool. I love this idea, but I didn't want to commit too hard to combined arms play. If I ever removed Gongkang, this is almost certainly the technology I'd replace it with, probably in the Imperial Age. And with all that, we finally come to the end of this Tibetan build. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. It's, again, the single most requested build I've ever had on the channel, and I certainly hope that I have delivered. And tell me how you liked that little North Asian architecture presentation. Is that the sort of thing you'd like to see in future builds as well, or do you think it derailed from the flow of this video too much? Before we round things off, let's take a look at the good old likeliniometer. In my opinion, how likely is it that the Tibetans, maybe looking a little something like what I have here, could appear in-game at some point in the future? And for the Tibetans, on the likeliniometer, we have a 3.5 out of 10. The Tibetans are, from what I have seen, one of the single most requested civilizations in all of Age of Empires, but there are geopolitical issues, shall we delicately say, that hold this back from being likely. Not impossible, especially considering how much clamor there is around it, but at a guess, I don't think that Microsoft will want to take the risk of introducing the Tibetans into the game. As cool and deserving as they would be. But that's just what I think. Now I want to know what you think. How did you like my build for the Tibetans? What would you have done differently? And of course, what else would you like to see me do on this channel going forwards into the future? But until then, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.